as you recall, one of the promises that the U.S. government made to the quote-unquote 5 civilized tribes and the other tribes that they removed during Indian removal was that they were going to build forts and man them with soldiers so as to protect those eastern Indians from the Indians who were already in Oklahoma, whose backyard they were now in, particularly the Osage that they had quite a bit of trouble with there in eastern Oklahoma, and the Comanches and Kiowa in western Oklahoma. Well, that was done. However, once the American Civil War started, and I mean almost immediately when the war started, those troops, those federal troops, were withdrawn from all those forts and pulled back to Kansas for the most part because, well, they were kind of in a vulnerable spot in those isolated forts in Indian Territory / Oklahoma, because the Confederate states of Arkansas and Texas, both nearby, Confederate forces were gathering. So those soldiers were needed, those Union soldiers were needed for the fight elsewhere, and the forts were abandoned. Well, a lot of the 5 tribes, including the Cherokees, Creeks, Choctaws, etc., felt that they too had been abandoned in this action, because that was part of the promise that they had been given, that in return, for their removal. So that was a treaty violation in their eyes, although from the perspective of the U.S., it was just a very practical decision. The Confederacy also made a practical decision, and that decision was because they wanted control of the area, because, well, to be honest, that region was very strategically important, because it was kind of the gateway between the East and the West, and because there was a lot of saltpeter mines in the area, enough probably to make gunpowder to provide for the entire Confederate Army for a very long time. So the Confederacy really wanted an alliance with those 5 tribes in eastern Oklahoma. So they sent a delegation. They sent some military diplomats to go and visit with the leadership of the 5 tribes. And this delegation was led by the gentleman there in the upper right named Albert Pike. He had just been made a colonel in the Confederate Army. He was a general not long after that. Albert Pike, fascinating, colorful guy. He was a renowned poet and a lawyer who had gained quite a bit of social capital and political and professional capital. He had written some important law books. He had also served as a lawyer for the Creek Nation in their efforts before the Civil War to try to get back some of the money they felt was owed to them by the U.S. So he knew the Creek leaders and the leaders of several of the other tribes. He was very pro-Indian. He also very famous figure in the leadership at that time of the Freemasons. There's a statue of him in Washington, D.C. So anyway, he led the delegation, and he was supported by the guy there in to the right, Ben McCulloch, who was at that time a lieutenant colonel but became a brigadier general not long after. The same Ben McCulloch we've talked about already, who was a Texas Ranger, one of the more famous Texas Rangers, and he had actually come to Texas with Davy Crockett. He's the guy that got sick and missed the Alamo. So anyway, the two of them, with McCulloch in charge of their military escort, went and met with the leadership of the Chickasaws, the Choctaws, the Seminoles, the Creeks, and got the leadership of all 4 of those nations to agree to sign an alliance with the Confederate States of America. Then he met with the Cherokee leader, John Ross, who is there on the far left. John Ross had been the principal chief of the Cherokees for, 35 years at that point, roughly. He had been the principal chief during the resistance and the lead up to Indian removal back in the late 1820s and into the 1830s. Well, John Ross was more reluctant than the others to make an alliance with the Confederacy. He wanted his people to be neutral in this fight, primarily because if you look at the map there, the Cherokee portion of Indian Territory is right there in the very upper right corner of what is now the state of Oklahoma. That means that if they get involved in the war and the Union Army were to invade Indian Territory from Kansas, why, guess who they'd hit first, and guess who would take the worst of it? The Cherokees. So he really didn't want to get involved, and made that clear to Pike and McCulloch. So what Pike did was he then had a meeting with another Cherokee, Stand Wadi, and he's the guy who's sitting there in the picture right next to John Ross. He was Ross's biggest political enemy. In fact, going back 25 years, back to the signing of the treaty that led to the Cherokee removal and the Trail of Tears. Stand Wadi was one of the principal leaders of that movement that was in favor of basically signing their land over to the U.S. government and voluntarily moving west for land there, as opposed to John Ross, who was the main leader of the Cherokees and who had the most support. Most Cherokees didn't want to be removed. And depending on how much you know about U.S. history and Cherokee history and Southern history, that actually led to a little civil war among the Cherokees because they felt like Major Ridge, Stan's uncle, who was in charge of that faction, had sold them out, and he was killed. Major Ridge and his son and his nephew, Stand Wadi's brother, Stand was actually attacked and managed to escape. He was the only one that escaped being killed. So, big, huge, long-standing political enemy of Ross. And there was a substantial number of Cherokees who were on his side still. Those divisions from the time of removal were still there. So what Pike did when Ross wasn't willing to play ball is he very publicly went and met with Stand Wadi, essentially implying, well, if Ross isn't going to give us what we want, we will go to his political rival. And when that happened, Ross, who was fearful that this could lead to yet another civil war within the Cherokee Nation, decided that he would compromise, and he didn't agree. He didn't agree to sign the alliance, but he did agree to a referendum, a vote of all the Cherokee people. So all the adult Cherokees got together and voted, and just barely the ones in favor of allying with the Confederacy won out. So Ross went along with that, and that meant that Pike had successfully gotten the leaders of all five of the quote-unquote civilized tribes to join this alliance. Now, how did he do that? Number one, he really reinforced the fact that the U.S. had violated the treaty by withdrawing from those forts. He also made the argument that the treaty that the Cherokees and the others had signed with the United States had been with the United States, and it wasn't united anymore. Everything had changed. So that was one argument. However, he sweetened the pot by making offers such as that if the five nations agreed to ally with the Confederacy, and if they raised armies to fight with the Confederacy, that the Confederate government would help equip them and get them uniforms and weapons. Also, he promised that each of the 5 tribes would have a seat in the Confederate Congress, and he promised that they would each have sovereignty if the Confederacy won. That is to say, this is something the U.S. refused to give them. That is to say that any crime committed in the Cherokee Nation, even if it was by a white guy from Texas, would be tried under Cherokee law. Well, those are several very enticing offers. Turns out Jefferson Davis did not authorize him to make all those offers, especially the ones about sovereignty and seats in the Congress. In fact, Davis made clear he had absolutely no intention of doing that. That was a matter of Pike, because he was so sympathetic toward the Indians, trying to give them a really good deal. And they didn't actually know that if the Confederacy had won, they would have been cheated on that in that regard. Nonetheless, they signed on, and there was a lot of fighting. There was also a lot of division. The governments of the tribes may have allied with the Confederacy, but all the people didn't. Depending on the tribe, among the Seminoles, quite a large number of individual Seminoles actually sided with the Union and joined the Union Army, and about probably 50-50 among the Cherokees and the Creeks. And the Choctaws and Chickasaws went more Confederate, but there were still a minority of them who were pro-Union. So what wound up happening, and maybe you were aware of this and maybe you weren't, is that both the Union and the Confederacy had all Indian regiments. There were Union Cherokees dressed in blue and Confederate Cherokees in gray, and they fought each other, and they also participated in actions against the regular Union and Confederate soldiers. Here on the map, you can see the major battles that took place in Indian Territory, and you can see that all those were in the northeastern part of Oklahoma in Cherokee and Creek territory. Turns out John Ross was right. The destruction that occurred in the Cherokee Nation and the Creek Nation was as bad and probably worse than any state in the South, as were the casualty rates, which a lot of folks don't know. Well, in addition to all that, when Pike and McCulloch were in Oklahoma and they were meeting with these various Indian tribes, they also went out to western Oklahoma to meet with the quote-unquote wild Indians as opposed to the civilized nations, right, in the east. So they met with the Comanches and Kiowa. Didn't offer them the same deal that they offered to the 5 nations, in large part because, the Comanches and Kiowas didn't have the type of highly organized Western-type government structure that the quote-unquote civilized nations did, nor did they have the resources. They're out there on the plains, whereas the Cherokees and the Creeks, they're up there in the lush riverlands that had really good agriculture and all the mines, salt mines and saltpeter mines. So what they were seeking with the Comanches and Kiowas was not a military alliance. It was a friendship alliance that was kind of like a non-combatant agreement, essentially. The Confederacy promised the Comanches and Kiowas, we won't attack you while this is all going on, and you don't attack us, and we'll just each mind our own business. So there's no need for us to be at war with each other. One of the principal Comanche leaders at that meeting was held at Fort Cobb, was this guy who's pictured there in between Stan Wadi and Ben McCulloch. In his older years, when he's on the reservation and has glasses and stuff, Ten Bears, who was a Yamparika band Comanche leader, and one of the most famous and significant Comanche leaders of his generation. The other really big, important leaders of his generation from the other bands were Iron Jacket, Quanah Parker's grandfather, and of course buffalo hump. In fact, Tin Bears, Iron Jacket, and Buffalo Hump had all been present way back in 1840 at Bent's Fort, at that trading post, where they met with the Comanches and Kiowas, met with the Cheyenne and Arapaho, and came to a peace agreement. So Tin Bears had been in on that. So had Little Raven that we just mentioned a little while ago, the guy who signed off at that Fort Wise Treaty for the Arapahoes. And so was a Kiowa leader named Satonk, and we'll be talking more about him later. Anyway, the Comanches signed this non-aggression pact with the Confederates, or as they called them, the Gray Jackets. And the agreement was we won't be raiding any Gray Jackets. Now, that really did not prevent them from attacking Blue Jackets, and as we'll see later, they did plenty of that. Now we're going to take a look at a conflict that happened in the early part of the Civil War in Minnesota that is known by various names. The most common and long-standing name for this conflict is the Dakota Uprising. That's what people called it at the time. Also, it's been referred to as the Dakota War, or the U.S. Dakota War, which is more accurate than Dakota Uprising. Sometimes it's called Little Crow's War. Uprising implies someone rising up against a proper authority, a rebellion, if you will. And the Dakota people regarded what they were doing, regarded themselves as a sovereign people, and what they were doing as defending their people, their land, and their sovereignty. So war is a much better appellation for what took place. Well, let's go back in time a little bit, a little over a decade, to 1851, around the same time that Fort Laramie Treaty was being signed with those 8 Northern Plains tribes, one of which was the Lakota. These are their relatives, their kinsmen, the Dakota, who signed a separate treaty, actually a couple of separate treaties in 1851 that essentially handed over a large part of their traditional lands for settlement. In fact, so many people who were going along that Oregon Trail stopped in Minnesota that it became a state by the end of that decade. There were enough people for that to happen. But just like with the Fort Laramie Treaty with those tribes, the agreement was that on the part of the U.S., they were going to provide annuities. They were going to provide, in particular, food for the various Dakota bands, because those Dakota bands were giving up a large portion of their hunting grounds. Well, little towns started springing up pretty quickly, and the population, like I said, grew quickly enough that within a few years it became a state. So reliance on those annuities was even more important for the Dakota. However, they didn't usually get them. They didn't get them on time, if they got them at all, and often they didn't get them at all, nor did they get a lot of the other things they were promised. Some of the stuff that was in the treaty was just completely ignored by the U.S. government. And then later on, they took more land, including the Pipestone Quarry in Pipestone, Minnesota, which is where catlinite or pipestone had been mined by the Dakota and by their ancestors for many generations, and was really prized by tribes throughout the region for their pipes. Well, by the early 1860s, things were getting pretty rough for the Dakota. There was a drought. They weren't getting the money they were supposed to be getting. Turns out that some of the government agents who were supposed to be distributing the food to the Dakota were actually keeping it and selling it on the black market to settlers for, well, I would say for a considerable profit, but since it was free for them, it was all profit, right? And it wasn't going to the Indians for whom it was intended by treaty. They managed to get some food on credit from some of the government agents, some of the government traders, but they refused to extend the Indians any more credit, which was really putting them in a bind because they weren't getting the money either that they were supposed to get. Finally, at one point, several of the Dakota leaders went to one of those government agents, government traders, asking for food that was due them, or at the very least credit to get food. And he said, because they said their children were starving, and he said, there's plenty of grass around here. Let them eat grass, which did not help things at all. This really ratcheted up a lot of tension between the Dakotas and the settlers. And it all came to a head in the summer of 1862 with an inciting incident. A lot of times, all it takes when there's this much tension is one spark. And that spark happened when a group of young Dakota men were out on a hunting party. And these were young men. These were not like seasoned warriors. And they went to this farm and snuck into the hen house and stole some of the eggs. And the lady of the house caught them in the act. And she came out with her broom, waving her broom around and yelling at them, And she cornered one of them there in the hen house or in the barn, and just smacked the crap out of him with her broom, and he ran away with her whacking him with a broomstick. And all of his friends made fun of him. Ha, ha, ha. Old white lady beat you with a broom. That's hilarious. So he was pretty embarrassed. So he went back and killed her and everybody else that was home, which also is not the way to improve relations. This immediately erupted into a large-scale war between the Dakotas and the settlers. And the Dakotas mobilized. Now, the bands in the northern part of the state were not interested in fighting and didn't participate, but the bands in the south did. Several of them, particularly the Santee Dakota, and the overall leader, the military leader of the Dakota force was this guy, Little Crow. And the fighting got really bad, in part because the Civil War is going on, and Minnesota, is a state. Minnesota is a union state, so a lot of the fighting age men in Minnesota had been mobilized into regiments and sent off to fight the war. So that put the settlers at a big disadvantage, and the Dakotas came through and they faced off against the militia that the Minnesotans did come up with, which was commanded by General Henry Hastings Sibley, who had been the previous governor of Minnesota. And they swept through several towns. They destroyed some small towns completely, burned them to the ground, and killed most of the people in them. Towns like Milford, Leavenworth, and Sacred Heart. It's estimated, by the time all was said and done, we know that there were 77 Minnesota militia soldiers killed, and there were about 150 Dakota warriors killed. The civilian casualties estimates range anywhere from a minimum of 400 and 450. Some estimates take it to double that. So it's safe to say at least 450 civilians were killed in this very brief but very intense war. And there were depredations. There were depredations on both sides, as there tended to be when you had militia fighting Indians on the frontier like this. And some of the depredations were pretty disturbing stuff. You know, there were pregnant women killed, various other things. Finally, though, the Dakota forces were defeated, decisively defeated. Little Crow and his son, I think his oldest son, managed to escape capture, and they were on a farm gathering berries to eat, and the farmer saw them, and there was a $25 bounty on the head of any Dakota Indians, and so he shot him dead, and he got $500 because this was Little Crow, the leader. Meanwhile, the Indians who had been captured, the warriors who had participated in the violence, they were captured, and 303 of them were put on trial in Minnesota. So this is a trial by their peers, which means 12 white guys from Minnesota. And you can imagine how that went, especially considering the fact most of these accused didn't speak any English, were not told what was even going on, certainly had no access to defense lawyers, and most of the trials took about, on the average, 5 minutes. In fact, they conducted 40-some trials in one day. So, just exactly how well researched and how well proven things were is certainly up for doubt. But all 303 were convicted and sentenced to be executed, which brings President Abraham Lincoln into the story. He was actually already brought into the story because the governor of Minnesota had appealed to President Lincoln to send troops to help put this uprising down, and he had troops under General John Pope, a famous Union general. That's what had helped seal the deal for the victory over the Dakotas. But now he has this situation where up in Minnesota they're planning to execute 303 Indians all at the same time, and that puts him in a bit of a bind. It puts him between a rock and a hard place because, on the one hand, the people of Minnesota, the white people of Minnesota, pretty darn ticked off about these Indians, and they want to kill all of them if they could. Many of them would just kill all the Indians. So a lot of anger there, a lot of desire for retaliation and revenge. At the same time, here we are. It's just 1 year into the Civil War. There's a lot of things to consider diplomatically on the international scale, because you may or may not be aware of this. You probably are. The Confederate States of America was seeking recognition from European countries. They were seeking support from countries like England and France. Obviously, the United States didn't want the Confederate States to get that. But if in the United States, all of a sudden, they're executing 303 Indians, particularly if the story gets out that the Indians got mad because their children were starving, that's going to look really bad, and it's going to hurt the diplomatic aims of the country. So President Lincoln can't let that happen, but at the same time, he can't let them all go because the white people of Minnesota, the citizens of the state of Minnesota, are going to go nuts. So he took about a month and looked over all the evidence and all the cases. And ultimately what he did was he commuted the sentences initially of 264 of the 303 Dakota men. Commuted their sentences, essentially saying they were not guilty of murder, which is what they had been charged and convicted with. And by the way, how can you charge and convict Indians that are not citizens and that are citizens of allegedly a semi-autonomous nation? Anyway, not guilty of murder because the killings they had done, he said, were killings in war. So they were acting as soldiers. You don't go around executing the soldiers just because they're on the losing side. However, of the 40 others, two of them had been charged with, and to Lincoln's satisfaction from the evidence, convicted of rape. The other 38 were convicted of killings that were not in battle, right? They weren't fighting against soldiers or even armed farmers fighting back. Rather, it was the massacre of civilians and women and children. So those 40, he did not commute their death sentences, except one of them. One of them he did, because there was some intercession, I think, from the governor of Minnesota, who said, I don't think this guy is guilty. So one of them got their sentence commuted, so that took it down. Eventually it was taken down to 38 Dakota men sentenced to be executed. And, in fact, they were executed in Mankato, Minnesota, on the day after Christmas, 1862. 38 of them put up on one big giant scaffold, and the lever was pulled, and in an instant, all 38 of them plunged to their doom. This was the largest mass execution in American history, and remains so to this day. Now, the other Dakotas, including their families, were, the other men whose sentences were commuted, they were sent to prison. They were put in a prison for some of them up to 5 years. Their families were also put in military prison camps. And then at the end of that period, all of them were kicked out of the state of Minnesota and put on reservations, put on a reservation right across down there across the Nebraska border, northern Nebraska. Some managed to avoid being rounded up and taken to the reservation, and they went westward and joined up with their kinsmen, the Lakota, in North and South Dakota nearby. And the Lakota and Dakota together, working together, actually over the next couple of years, had several raids into Minnesota, and the Minnesota militia, once more led by Sibley, had several battles with the Lakota and Dakota over the next couple of years. This is not something, obviously, that the Dakota people ever forgot or ever will forget, but their related branch. Remember, the Sioux are in 3 branches: the Lakota, Dakota, and Nakota. So what happened to the Dakota in the minds of their kinsmen, representatives from all 3 of those branches were part of the 7 council fires, the Oceti-Sakowin. So whatever happened to the Dakota might as well have happened to the Lakota. So far as the Lakota were concerned, this did not endear them to the United States government.